Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. We've talked a lot about gender on this show, in the context of transgender rights, the way declining relative status drives men to the political right, and the broader role gender plays in the political environment. The results of the presidential election in November proved just how central gender is to the story of rising illiberalism, with men shifting right while women shifted left. To discuss how we should read this shift and dig into what's causing it, I brought back Samantha Hancox-Li, who I last had on the show in September to talk about the distinction between progressivism and liberalism. Samantha's a writer, a game designer, and associate editor at Liberal Currents, where she recently published an excellent essay called The Crisis of Gender Relations. If you enjoy Reimagining Liberty, I encourage you to check out my companion newsletter, where I write about the kinds of ideas we discuss on this show. You can find it on my website at www.aaronrosspowell.com. Now, let's turn to my conversation with Samantha. There seem to be two stories that came out of the election results. The first, which I talked about in my last episode with Walter Olson, is it turns out voters don't like inflation and vote against whoever they blame for the inflation, or in this case, vote for whoever they remember being in office when there wasn't inflation. But the second story, and I think the more interesting one, is about gender. Is that we saw young women in particular break for Harris. We saw young men in particular turn pretty dramatically towards Trump and the right. And that story seems to be playing out not just in the US, but throughout Europe as well. And so I think as we look forward over the coming years, that question about men and women and political preferences and what's going on will be quite relevant and more lasting than inflation. So with that in mind, what is going on with gender?
What is going on with gender? That's a big question. And I think you're right to focus on it. So there's the partisan political divergence, which is quite stark, and gets larger among younger cohorts. It's quite widespread across the developed world. It's hardly the only way in which gender has become kind of central to our politics. Abortion was a central issue for the last election. Abortion was on the ballot in many states. Abortion was central to Harris's campaigning. Finally overturning Roe versus Wade was, central to Trump's pitch to certain parts of his base. Trans rights have been one of the very first policy kind of blow-ups of the new administration when Nancy Mace, a Republican congresswoman, successfully argued that Sarah McBride, the first trans congresswoman, should be banned from women's bathrooms on Capitol Hill. Marjorie Taylor Greene actually threatened to attack McBride if she saw her in a bathroom. And this is on top of, these are things that are kind of central political issues, but there's also stuff that's so much more, it seems kind of ephemeral. Elon Musk, the world's richest man, recently spent about $250 million to buy himself a seat in the presidential administration. And, what's he do with his time? Well, he's up at 2 a.m. posting about how boobs in video games are too small these days. And it's kind of tempting to see these things as all kind of different, or maybe some of them are just a culture war or, like I said, ephemeral issues that are a distraction from the real political issues of our time. But I think gender is one of the central political issues of our time, and people know it and people respond to it. Um, in more material terms, you can see across the right, especially an obsession with birth rates. The extent to which they talk about this on the campaign trail is variable, but they're very concerned with it. Um, from the overtly racist conspiracies like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, the content of the Nazi slogan, the 14 words, is about children. It's about white children and this fear that there aren't enough of them. Um, and I mean, on some level, they're right that something's happening. Birth rates are declining. They are declining across the Western world. They are declining across the world, generally speaking, both the developed world and the moderately developed world, and in some places, the not very developed world. Um, in some countries, birth rates have dropped below replacement. Um, that can sound like, yeah, I mean, really, who cares? But then you look at a country like South Korea. South Korea has about point 0.8 total fertility rate, point 0.8 children per woman on a national average. And they have a very, very low rates of immigration. Um, and what that means, in effect, is that each generation of South Koreans is going to be less than half the size of their predecessor. South Korea, if things continue as they are, even if the birth rate doesn't get any lower than it has, is going to become a much smaller country very, very fast. And that's going to be a problem for them in a couple of different ways. It's going to be a problem for them economically. They're going to have a very top-heavy population pyramid. It's going to cause various kinds of economic dislocation. Um, and of course, they're also still technically at war with their neighbor North Korea, who proposes to unify them by force and is run by an insane dictator. Or not insane, but certainly not exactly the kind of neighbor you want to have. And so, again, a crashing population is going to be a problem for you if you're a small country with a bellicose neighbor, as many countries around the world are. Um, and so what I really want to get at here is that there are a lot of different things happening in the world that seem kind of unconnected, right? Whether it's Me Too or Gamergate, these things that, are culture wars or wars over our bodies or are, you know, thought to be kind of pressing material concerns, but they're all about gender. Um, it's not a poly crisis, it's a mono crisis. I don't know if that really answered your question, but there's certainly something to talk about there.
There's a lot more to dig into, but let me start with asking a clarifying question, because these terms come up all over the place and are very central to a lot of the culture war arguments. When we talk about gender, what do we mean? And do we mean something different than biological sex? Because I've had episodes of this show, like with Gillian Brandstetter, about gender, and those are often in the context of people being upset, particularly about trans people who are complicating stories for them about gender and what gender means. But a lot of the story that we are seeing out of the election maps more onto what people would think of as biological sex. It's a story of cis men and cis women. So for the most part, like or maybe I'm wrong there, but like, can we unpack what we mean by gender in this context?
I think that's a good question. I'm going to try and skip over a long history of feminist theorizing about what these terms mean and just talk a little bit about how I see them. I mean, to start with, humans are biological animals, right? And there seems to be, broadly speaking, a bimodal distribution in that biology that kind of clusters around what we think of as male and female. Which is not to say that there are only two sexes. There's in fact quite a lot of more biological diversity than people really realize. in that mix and in ways that can really surprise people. So, for example, there are women, it's often said, women have XX chromosomes and men have XY chromosomes, and that explains everything. And that's not actually true. Um, and just setting aside trans issues, there are cis women who are XY and have children without any trouble. A little bit surprising, but it happens. I mean, we don't really know exactly the population prevalence of this because we don't karyotype individuals on a regular basis. Anyways, this is a much more larger and complicated subject. I could talk about it for a while. But I just want to say that there is this thing, biology. It's complicated, but it's broadly speaking bimodal. And it's the central thing going on here is reproduction. It's the production of children. And I don't really we all kind of know how that works. And then there's the other thing, the social side of it. The meaning that we give to the body in society. The stories we tell ourselves about what makes for, about what, the stories we tell ourselves about what kind of biology we have and what that means, stories about what makes for a good man and a good woman. And then, of course, not just stories, but laws, restrictions on what you can do or be or become, depending on how your body is thought to be. We have less of those than we used to, but we used to have a lot more of them. One good example is that if you got married and you had a female body, you couldn't have a bank account. All the bank accounts belonged to the person in the marriage with the male body, right? To put it a little bit counterintuitively. And these things, this social world of meaning is, again, more complicated than a simple binary. And then, of course, there's the inner thing. What's sometimes called gender identity, your sense of yourself that seems to some extent connected with how other people perceive you, but not entirely, certainly not entirely. Many people have a deep inner sense of what they're supposed to be. And that applies as much to cis women as to trans women, as much to cis men as to trans men. It's something that we all, or whatever, again, story's complicated. And my view is that these three things, the inner sense of the self, the social roles, and the biological reality, are connected, but not as tightly as people seem to think. That there's a kind of loose tether that connects these different realms, and we have a lot of space to kind of play around with it. But they all affect each other. This is why I say that I'm interested in political economy, not economics and not politics, but political economy, because there is always this connection between the material world and the social constructions. And you have to analyze them as kind of a comprehensive system. Sorry, that was, again, kind of an abstract answer.
No, I think that was helpful. And I don't know, in the many conversations on this show that we've had about gender, I don't know that we've had a teasing out like that. So I think that was probably helpful for listeners as well. So given this, and given the split that we've seen, and given the political economy side, you mentioned Gamergate. We've seen the rise of people like Andrew Tate. We've seen the rise of people like Jordan Peterson, who's making similar arguments to Tate, but I think in a softer way, or a less like overtly misogynistic way, even though that's quite present in his work. You see the rise of incel culture. And it seems like one way to tell this story is there's a lot of men out there who can't find a girlfriend, have a hard time finding a girlfriend, and don't like it. Which is, that's a fairly universal straight guy experience is, like, I'd like a girlfriend and I don't have one. But it turned political. I remember joking once there's a East Bay punk rock band called Mr. T Experience. And the front man is a guy named Dr. Frank or Frank Portman. And he wrote a song for them long ago called "Even Hitler Had a Girlfriend," which is about it's from the point of view of a young guy who wants a girlfriend, and the song is just like, even Hitler, the worst guy in the world, got a girlfriend. Why can't I get one? Um, and I joked to Frank once that essentially the story of the American right is people who listened to his song and took the wrong message from it. Decided the solution was to become Hitler in order to get the girl. And that seems to be the story of a lot of this, is that young men can't find a girlfriend, don't like it, and turn far right. Is that an accurate description of kind of our political environment?
I think that's certainly how they see it, but I think the story is more complicated than that. Um, and so I wrote about this recently in an essay called "A Crisis of Gender Relations," and I drew on an older feminist concept of the patriarchal bargain, um, which is fundamentally this political economic concept about how do humans manage reproduction, production and reproduction, frankly. Um, and under the conditions of the patriarchal bargain, women are excluded from full social participation, economic participation, legal participation, right? That like I said, the husband owns the bank account, or that, you can't bear witness in your own case, various ways of excluding women from equal access to society, to being a free and equal citizen. And as a result, they don't really have a lot of choice but to become a wife. And what you're looking for when you get married is a husband who will provide the things that you're unable to provide for yourself because you're excluded from, again, full social participation. So things like economic security, physical security, social status, all these things that you cannot attain as a single woman. And you marry into your husband's family, and he kind of provides these things for you. Yeah. And in exchange, you provide reproductive labor. That means childbearing. It means child rearing. That means guarantees of paternity. That's kind of an important part of the whole patriarchal bargain. Um, and this is a system of the world, of society. It's not every society in the ideal form. It's highly variable based on both culture and material factors. But it gets at something about the way the world is organized. And we have been living through a time for the last several centuries, in fact, where it's breaking down. Um, and it's breaking down, especially because women are able to get all those things without having a husband, right? You are able to earn a living outside of the house and support yourself, right? The returns. I mean, this is why we have dual income households today, is because the returns to working outside of the house are so high that no one would actually want to work inside the house, right? They want the stuff that you can get from working outside of the house. Um, Expansions of legal rights, expansions of social norms that, accept women as single, as like that's just a normal thing to be, um, that have made it so that so to speak, that the exclusion of women has broken down, and as a result, the rents to men, the economic and social rents to men have also decreased. That women have options, and men can't. Men who once upon a time, like, yeah, maybe they were an asshole, maybe they were emotionally unavailable, maybe they were a mess, but like, yeah, they earn money and I can't earn money myself, so I got to settle. Well, if I don't have to settle, why would I shack up with that guy? He's a mess and he's a buff. And like, and so when you say to bring this back to both incels and Tate and lonely young men, you know, functionally, in the economy we live in, if you're a young man and you want a girlfriend, like, it's not impossible, but you have to make yourself wanted even if you're not needed. And some men really rebel at that idea. They want to be needed and they feel entitled to a woman who depends on them, who is subservient to them. Um, and if you look into how Tate works and the advice he gives to young men, functionally, what his advice is, what his program is you need to recreate the conditions of the patriarchal bargain. They don't exist, but they can be created artificially. So what you do is you find a young woman, and the first thing you have to do is isolate her from her friends. That is number one with a bullet, is get her psychologically isolated and dependent on you psychologically. If at all possible, get her to quit her job. You want her to be economically dependent on you. Right? That you create these conditions of dependence that, again, don't necessarily exist in a natural way, but like, if you work hard at it, maybe you can, you're a good kind of psychopath, you can create them in a specific person. Um, and so that's what a lot of these angry young men are looking for, is a way to recreate these older conditions of female subservience and male dominance. And the reason that it's driving them all insane is that we don't live in that world. Um, as I said, as we can all kind of see, is that is not the society we live in any longer. And the conflict between the stories that they're telling themselves about what they want and what makes for a good man are running into conflict with the material reality of the world that we live in.
I'm curious about the chicken and eggness of this story because, as you said, the experience of being, say, a teenage boy and wanting a girlfriend and not having one is pretty that's not new, right? Like that's been the experience of teenage boys as long as teenage boys have been around. Um, and and yet it's been historically the case that you kind of have to work at it to be alone your whole life. Like, most people who want to find a partner do. And it might take them longer than they wanted, but most people do. That's been the case forever. Um, and and so what I wonder is how much we are in a situation where the world, like the situation we're in right now, is the result of the world changing such that it is simply like harder to find a girlfriend than it used to be, um, or that there's a culture that has risen up among the sources that men go to for information, which have largely like the the places young men congregate online, the hobbies young men are into, video games, sports, fitness, and so on, have really been kind of colonized by far right influencers. That what they're being told is a story that essentially says this universal experience that you're going through right now, that everybody goes through, is in fact not universal. It is new, it is politicized, and here's the solution to it. But the problem is that the solution they're being given makes them less desirable. So instead of like just putting in a little bit of effort, they are being told, no, it's not you, it's them. Become more hateful, do all these things that are going to make it more challenging to find a girlfriend, find a spouse, um, be appealing, and so on. And I guess I ask because if we're in the former, where simply like women can be more choosy than they used to be because economically they have more options, so the patriarchal bargain doesn't look as much of a bargain anymore. That seems like a challenging problem to overcome from the perspective of getting young men feeling like they can have the kind of lives that they want, because there just are men who are not going to be very successful, are not going to provide a lot, and they're going to have a harder time than they used to. That seems like a real challenge to overcome. But if it's more of the cultural, then it seems easier in the sense that it's like, stop listening to Andrew Tate, stop reading Jordan Peterson, and just become a more appealing guy and you'll be okay.
So, I mean, as I've kind of talked about earlier, my view is that it's both. That the culture has its own logic and the material has its own logic, and that they feed back into each other in important ways. Um, and so so let me go through some examples, some little case studies. Um, the rise of single men and single women is measurable and noticeable across the developed world. Um, and if you ask a single mother, you know, what do you want from life? Oftentimes, in America, she'll tell you she doesn't want to be a single mom. She wants to have a husband who's a partner, right? Who will help her with the kids and with the bills and with this whole process of raising children together. But she can't find one, right? That the men around her are just not really good catches, right? That, what's the line? A man marries a woman, he gets, a woman without a job and he gets a live-in maid. A woman marries a man without a job and she gets a live-in gamer. Um, right? He doesn't work, but he doesn't help around the house either, and he expects her to do both. Um, right? And so women are looking at that and they're like, that's not a good deal for me. I mean, not every woman, yada, yada, but like the trends are there. So there's a sense in which, women have more options and they are, outs that don't involve the patriarchal bargain. They can to some extent support themselves just as single moms or definitely as single women. And so they're opting out. Um, and so some of that's material. But like you say, some of it's cultural too, right? That these, like you say, men are, well, I said it myself, you get a live in gamer, that men feel it demeans them to be their wife's homemaker. I mean, there still people make jokes about that. I'm a stay-at-home dad. And like some people mean it in a good way, but they're like, you can tell they're trying to reclaim it um, from a kind of negative connotation. That all this kind of domestic work, care work, it is seen as feminine, and to do something that's feminine it's seen as emasculating yourself. Um, and men don't like that very much. It turns out. Um, and so, like you say, that there is this cultural industry that is springing up that exists to tell men that it's not their fault, right? That it's just, it's the problem is with society, and we've let, you know, well, I don't even want to repeat some of that rhetoric. Um, I like to go to South Korea as kind of an example here, um, because it shows, so to speak, a vision of the bad timeline, um, where, as I noted at the outset, South Korea has very low birth rates. And in large part, that's because women in South Korea don't want to have children, because women in South Korea recognize that they live in a very patriarchal society, that there are a lot of expectations that like you have to be a mother, and being a mother means giving up your career and all this other stuff. And they're like, I don't want that. I don't want to live a life in which I am like meant to be the property of my husband. So I choose not to. And the response of men in South Korea has been to get increasingly radicalized into misogyny, and to double down on patriarchal ideas and patriarchal ideology. Um, this was a huge issue in the last presidential election there. We're seeing the return of political lesbianism in the 4B movement in South Korea. So you can see, there's this kind of radicalization feedback loop in which men are unhappy with the situation, and their response is not to pursue effective solutions, but to double down on the things that are causing that situation in the first place. Um, it's not a great outcome, frankly.
This is all a story of what we could call low status men. So the men who are no longer able to attain the patriarchal bargain because they're not able to provide the stuff that used to be what they would provide in that. And so they're not earning a good paycheck. They do not look like a good catch, as you put it. But I'm curious about how high status men fit into this story, because we have seen a similar turn against feminism, similar kind of concerns about the rising status of women among higher status men, and particularly men who work in high status fields that used to be male dominated, and now women are showing up. And sometimes it manifests as open misogyny, but sometimes it manifests as, say, a real affinity for evolutionary psychology that explains why my field that's been traditionally dominated by men, that's kind of a natural consequence. They often cling to the fact that at like very high levels of mathematics, men tend to be better than women at that. And then use that as a justification for kind of disagreements all the way down into every field, or disparities into every field that does not involve the bleeding edge of theoretical mathematics. But those men they're all earning big paychecks. They have all the signs of good catchness, I suppose. Is that a related phenomena, or are we just kind of seeing these two things happening in parallel?
So I think I'm going to tell two stories about this. Um, One of them is that status is always a little bit relative, to your particular social milieu. And so there are a number of studies that will show that the people in a given field, or even if it is a high status field and a high paying field, within that field, the people who are most expressive about misogyny, but also about racism, about anything involving the entrance of functionally new competitors for your job, are the mediocre ones, right? Not the ones who are the superstars in their field, who who are not threatened by new competition because they know they're good, right? It's the people who are at the bottom of the ladder who are like, I really need to keep out new competitors, whether that's women or that's Black people or whatever it happens to be at the current time. Um, so certainly that can be an explanation for why, a mid-level coder at Google, objectively is making a ton of money, but like in his particular field feels threatened by the entrance of women into again, traditionally masculine fields. There's a more complicated story about coding, about how we gender that and so on. But there's another story you can tell, which is that one of the things that I've really come to believe when I talk about rents is that it's not just economic rents that people like, but it's social rents. Or put another way, it is the psychic wage of hierarchy. That when you are on top of a hierarchy, you have people to look down on and people who look up to you. And that feels really nice. People really like that feeling. And this is not my own view. This is just an old philosophical tradition. It's associated with Rousseau and the concept of amour propre. Frankly, it's there in Plato, in the concept of thumos. I could go on about this. But this idea that we live in the eyes of others, and that we want the respect of others, and not just the respect always, but sometimes we like having a little bit of power over other people. We like being in a dominant position. And for some men, especially, that's what they want. They don't want a woman who is equal to them, right? Even if they could get one easily because they were a good catch, they don't want an equal partner. They want subservience, and they fear they're not getting it. Right. So I think that certainly is an important explainer of this entire dynamic at every level of society.
This all sounds pretty challenging then, from a socio-political standpoint, because uh, because we are seeing as the result of this a shift in men. Men were always further to the right than women historically in voting patterns, but that shift has grown. Um, it makes one thing we didn't talk about is why they shift to the specifically to the right versus say the left, because you could imagine a world where they say, look, what we actually need then is to if women are opting out of me because they can do better elsewhere, we need systems that increase equality. So we're kind of more, everyone's on the same playing field. I don't know that that story actually works, but you might be able to spin up some version of it. But the right is, it makes sense that it's the right because the right is primarily about and always has been about the reification and reinforcement of social hierarchies of class, race, gender, nationality, and so on. That's the basic project of the political right for as long as it's been around. So that makes sense, but that's bad for those of us who care about liberalism and a liberal order and the flattening of hierarchy and actual social equality and egalitarianism and so on. Um, but if the story here is that men were effectively used to a certain degree of status and companionship, even if it's in this kind of warped hierarchical way, that just came from the fact of being men. And that has shifted because women have more economic options than they used to. Our economy has moved in more of a knowledge work. Brute upper body strength is not the path to riches anymore. Um, that's not something we want to fix. We don't want to like remove women from the workforce or go back to a physical labor based economy. That would not be good for really anyone, even if the return with a capital V folks long for that kind of world. Um, but what that means is that we have a substantial problem facing not just society here, but it looks like, throughout the developed world, that is taking our politics in an increasingly dark direction. And it's driven by such change that men are noticing and reacting poorly to, but we can't undo the change. So what do we do in this situation? Like, how does liberalism make itself appealing? How does equality between the sexes, between genders, and then also racial and ethnic equality and other, because the same story plays out in other areas. How do we maintain liberalism if essentially this story is the fruits of liberalism are really off-putting to a significant portion of the population such that they want to overthrow the liberal order in order to get back to unimagined past where they were high status and had a girlfriend?
Yeah. I mean, like, number one, I'm sorry. I'm a feminist. We're not generally cheerful people. It's hard to be when you study society from that perspective. Um, on the other hand, I mean, if you look back at the history of the last 200 years, I mean, this has always been a struggle, right? Right. Feminists from the very, very first beginnings of feminism in the West, a couple hundred years ago, were pretty outright about asserting, the moral equality of women, that we were, in fact, as good and as important and as deserving of human rights as men. And that idea has always unnerved people. There has always been reaction to it from the very beginning, much more serious reaction than we are seeing today, much more widespread reaction than we are seeing today. Um, and at the same time, like you are saying, the conditions that are driving this are just the conditions of the modern world, right? A world in which, the path to power, to national power, to individual power through production, through economic production, is just less and less dependent on, your quote, merely biological factors and more dependent on, what's in here between your ears and your ability to produce in a modern economy. And it's unlikely that anyone is really going to be able to change to fight that particular tide. It's been rolling in for 200 years. Um, we just happen to be living through an era of intensified backlash to these events. Um, what do I think we can do about it? I mean, like you say, it's a matter. I'm very much of the opinion that this is a matter of winning a cultural fight, a fight over ideas and people's perceptions of themselves. Like you say, making liberalism appealing. And there's a line I like, that we spent generations teaching our daughters that they could be anything they wanted to be. And our daughters heard it and believed it and did it. And we did not spend a generation teaching our sons to live in a world where women can be anything they want to be. And that, our sons are not adapting well to that world. So I don't think this is really a fight we're going to win in a year, or 2 years, 3 or 4 or 5. This is a long struggle to get people to see the world in a different way, to see each other as free and equal citizens, and for that to be enough for them, right? To find, I mean, whatever, to drop out of the abstract here. It's like, man, Andrew fucking Tate is like a Romanian sex trafficker who lives in some weird house in Romania and like has no human connections with anyone around him. Even the men, right? There's no human connection there. It's just all these relations of like power and extraction and dominance. And like, that's no way to live. Right? To find real connection with another human being on equal terms, to find a partner that you can love and who loves you back for yourself, even when, they don't need you, they want you. That's a beautiful thing. And I think, yeah, we have to spend some time telling that story and getting people to believe it.
That is one of the striking things about the guys who are pushing this message is Andrew Tate does not seem to be particularly appealing. Jordan Peterson is just an absolute like psychological and emotional mess.
Yeah, no, he's a train wreck, right? Like
Elon Musk, as you mentioned at the beginning, with his just nonstop Twitter and video games and talking about how female characters in those games aren't hot enough by his standards and so on. Like these do not seem like aspirational sorts of guys. And I wonder if Tim Walz, part of the appeal of him during the few months that he was campaigning was he seemed to present an alternative vision of what masculinity could look like that stuck to, to back up a second, you mentioned we spent decades telling our daughters they could be whatever they wanted to be, and they believed us, and they went out and did it. We didn't tell our sons that, by and large. We kept telling them, no, you need to be masculine in this particular way. And that's the way that for a lot of them, the head of household, the making a living with just a high school degree, doing manly sorts of things, like that's off the table for most men now, especially in the developed world, or it's less available to them than it used to be. But we didn't tell them they could go out and there's lots of money to be made in nursing, but we tell men we don't tell our sons you can go out and be a nurse or a teacher or whatever other fields out there, service industry related things. And so it feels like we need that alternative vision of it. And I was struck again by Walz was someone who did the kind of manly things, the car fixing and knew about electronics and played video games and all of that. But in this way that was the absolute antithesis of the Jordan Petersons and the Andrew Tates in the way that he presented himself, the kind of caring and compassion and the stories about being helpful in ways that were not the hard-edged version of masculinity that young men are being sold. Does that chart a path forward? Do we need to essentially be telling young men, like, you can essentially be masculine without being an asshole?
I mean, I certainly think that's a good message. So I was talking about this topic with my friend and colleague, Maya Mendel, recently, and she talked about some studies that seem to show that young men don't necessarily believe that men ought to be traditionally masculine, tough and emotionless and blah, blah, blah. And they didn't themselves think that men had to be that way. What they did think was that other men thought that they had to be that way. So that they to some extent they're shaping their behavior based on not even their own desires, but their fears of being judged. Which, I mean, let's be honest, are very real, right? People are, like, we live in the eyes of others and we are afraid of being judged and we do want to be respected. So some of this just involves that culture change, that making it recognizable and respectable to do things like be a nurse, to be a homemaker, to be a dad who just that's his life, right? He's a father to his children. He's raised children, and that's good. And for those to become socially accepted role models, so that young men can think, well, I can do that and be respected, right? Be valued. That people won't make me the butt of jokes, right? I don't think we're entirely there yet, but
Thank you for listening to Reimagining Liberty. If you enjoyed today's episode, please send it to a friend, or take a moment to review the show on Apple Podcasts, and check out my free newsletter at www.aaronrosspowell.com.